Hello, church family. We are coming to you with another video. Hopefully, we're working out a few of the kinks on this process of looking at the actual text and wrestling through it. In some ways, we're trying to use the Swedish method with its light bulb, question mark, and arrow, its Bible icon, thinking of other places to look. We're trying to bring that to the text and think through what we're seeing in some of these stories that unfold in the final week of Christ's earthly ministry. So if you have the study guide and a Bible, let's look at Matthew chapter 21, the paragraph that follows the triumphal entry of Christ, which we studied on Sunday. And now I want us to consider this paragraph of Jesus cleansing the temple to see what is here for us. So, number one on our study guide, let's dive right in. Read the parallel passages that describe the triumphal entry of Christ. We're told in each of those accounts, different details. You can compile them together. Hopefully you've done that, or you could still do that on your own or with your family. We're also reminded in number 2 that the triumphal entry of Christ riding into Jerusalem on a donkey fulfills the prophet Zechariah's prophecy in chapter 9, verse 9. And what I want us to see there is that there is a title given to Jesus as he entered the temple. And the title given to Jesus in Zechariah is King. So we would expect him to come to a palace, but this king does not go to the palace. Instead, he goes to the temple. And so the question is, what does the kingship of Jesus have to do with the temple? That's a good question for us to wrestle through. It's a question that arises out of the text, and I think we can have a pretty good answer to that question as we realize that this kingdom, the kingdom that Jesus came preaching, establishing, inaugurating, this kingdom was built on the worship of God. It was a spiritual kingdom. In Luke chapter 17, Jesus tells the Pharisees, you're not going to be able to look and see the kingdom being built. You're not going to point to it or visit it. But the kingdom is among us. It's in our hearts. So it's a spiritual kingdom that Jesus came to establish. Now I want us to look at another question that arises out of the text. And that question has to do with verse 12 and 13. Jesus enters the temple and he drove out all those who are these people that were driven out, sold and bought in the temple. They're called the money changers and all who sold pigeons. So we have another question. What's wrong with this? Why was Jesus so upset by what was taking place? Was it wrong to sell and buy the temple? Was it wrong to change money? Was it wrong to sell animals for sacrifice? When we look at Luke chapter 2, we see our first clue. Mary and Joseph take Jesus to the temple to dedicate their firstborn son according to the Levitical law, and they purchase turtle doves or pigeons and make their sacrifice. So according to Luke chapter 2, this process of either selling the animal sacrifices and for now, by implication, the idea of exchanging money, currencies, exchanging a foreigner's money into Jewish coin so that he could pay his temple tax, those for now seem to be legitimate. It's just that the legitimate process was corrupted, verse 13, as the money changers and those who sold pigeons now took something legitimate and corrupted it. It had become a den of robbers. It wasn't a place of convenient money exchange or a place to purchase a spotless lamb or bird. Instead, there was cheating going on. People were being ripped off. All that right in the place of worship. So what was wrong? It seems to be what was wrong was the heart of the people doing the selling. They were cheaters. They were robbers. Well, number 4 on our study guide, Matthew 21:13 records Jesus saying, "It is written." It is written. And what does he say is written? 2 phrases in this verse. They come from different places. The first from Isaiah 56, "My house shall be called a house of prayer." The second from Jeremiah 7, "You have made it a den of robbers." Looking at Jeremiah 7 first, there's a warning. Don't claim to believe in God if you live like the devil. It's essentially what we see Jeremiah saying. He's saying, you think you can say that everything's peaceful and good and you're doing right, but notice what God did to some of the other places of worship when they degenerated into self-promotion instead of the promotion of the true and living God. Jeremiah addresses a heart of unbelief, even if outwardly the actions are those of worship. They don't go together. And here's our first sign to a theme of this paragraph, this warning of unbelief. Now let's look at Isaiah 56. "My house shall be called a house of prayer." What's going on in Isaiah 56? What does this word prayer represent? Because the temple was more than just a place to pray, it was a place of sacrifice. Ultimately, what Isaiah 56 is showing us is it's a place of fellowship, of relationship, of belonging. When you read Isaiah 56, it's about the foreigner, about the stranger, the Gentile, being brought into fellowship with the true and living God. They can actually have a relationship with God. They can belong to God's family. They can take his name and he will give them a place. And that's the promise in verse 5 or 6. They will have a place and a name, a monument and a name. That speaks to true belief. True belief. A belief that then is rewarded with a place and a name. Now, a bit of history here. A few decades back, when Israel was seeking to name their Holocaust museum in Israel, the primary Holocaust memorial, they went to Isaiah 56 and borrowed this phrase, a place and a name, or a monument and a name, to represent the idea that the millions of Jews who were killed under Nazi Germany's reign would still have a place and a name, and they would be remembered. They would have a place to belong. And so the Holocaust Museum became known as Yad Vashem. 2 words then, a place and a name. Not the exact context of Isaiah 56, but appropriate in the sense of the memorial being established there in Israel. The good news of Isaiah 56 is that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, will be brought into fellowship, will have a relationship with God, and they will take his name, they will belong to his family. That's good news, but it comes on the backdrop of Matthew chapter 21, where there seems to be blatant unbelief. Now we come to verse 14. The question on your study guide is this. Number 5, Matthew 21, verse 15 begins with a word of contrast, the word but. I'm asking you, what 2 ideas are set in contrast? What comes before the word but, and what contrasting idea comes after? So let's start with that task. What comes before, what comes after? Then we'll figure out what it's telling us. What comes before? Well, we're starting our idea in verse 14. That's what comes before. The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and here's the main idea of before. He healed them. He healed them. He, Jesus, healed them. Who's the them? The blind and the lame. He healed them. Okay, that's the before. What differs from that in some way? Well, let's read on in verse 15. When the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, well, that in a sense renames the healing. When they saw that he healed them and saw, or we could say heard, the children crying out in the temple, Hosanna to the Son of David. Here's the after. They were indignant. They were indignant. This is hard to figure out. What went so wrong between Jesus healing them, but they were indignant? Or we could say angry. What is so wrong that we would go from the wonderful things, but they were angry? That's quite a flow if we eliminated all the in-between and we just read Jesus healed the blind and lame wonderfully, but the scribes and chief priests were angry. So the question on the study guide then is, having identified this contrast, figure out why. Why are we told this information about blind and lame coming into the temple, being healed, and the Pharisees being angry? Well, I think the answer is coming to us as we continue to see their unbelief. They're not interested in promoting Jesus as the Messiah. They're interested in promoting themselves. And when we read in Mark's gospel of this account, they hated what was going on, and it says they feared Jesus because crowds were astonished at his teaching. There was a jealousy, there was an envy. They were losing control of the common people, the populace. John adds that many were going away and believing in Jesus. And it makes the scribes furious. So they say to Jesus, "Do you hear what these are saying? Hosanna, Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Do you hear what they're saying? And they're not asking yes or no. That's not their point. Their point is, are you going to do something about this? It's blasphemy. Do you hear what they're saying? Interestingly, Jesus answers a question with a question. Have you never read? So one question is matched by another. Have you never read? Out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise. Psalm 8 reminds us that God has prepared strength from the little ones. You could compare that with Matthew 11:25 and see that God has revealed his truth to children. Here's the challenge that I left you with in the final question. When we look in verse 17, it begins with the phrase, "and leaving them." So Jesus is doing the leaving. Them is the chief priests and scribes. But we have a couple of things to wrestle with here in trying to connect this phrase, "and leaving them," to Jesus' last question to the Pharisees, "Have you never read?" I wanted you to wrestle through the connection here. Have you never read? And leaving them. What's causing the question? Two things. Have you never read, out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise? Well, the answer is, of course, they had read. Of course they had read that. These are the masters of the Old Testament. Of course they had read. So Jesus' point wasn't about had their eyes ever fallen on the page. It's, why won't you believe? Why won't you believe? So have you never read? Of course they had. And leaving them with this question, the text says, he went out. I want to know, why does this phrase, and leaving them, even need to be there if leaving them and he went out are the same? But I don't think they are the same. I think leaving them is telling us how he went out. His going out was very intentionally leaving them. And how did Jesus leave them? What had he just said? He just said, have you never read? Will you not accept? Will you not believe? Therefore, his leaving is tied to his question. Leaving them is tied to they don't read, which is equal to they don't believe. Jesus went away from them because they would not believe. He wasn't only going to Bethany, he was leaving them in their unbelief. In some of the feedback, somebody wisely highlighted that this was much like Jesus' teaching to not cast our pearls before swine. Jesus was only going to say so much. If they won't believe, if they won't accept, if they won't hear what the scriptures say, then even the stones will have to cry out. There's a couple things that are coming up that are going to echo this theme of unbelief. Pearls before swine. Number 2, cursing the fig tree. Jesus comes to the tree expecting to find some figs, and they're not there. There should have been fruit, and there wasn't, and the tree is cursed. And it pictures the nation of Israel because they would not believe. And when we think of this last phrase, and leaving them, he went out. Leaving them because they would not hear what the scriptures say. In just a few chapters later in Matthew's gospel, we'll hear Jesus saying, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have gathered you under my wings, and you would not." The great agony of Matthew chapter 21 is that Jesus is announcing himself as God's hope for sinners, and his people would not believe. John was right. He came unto his own, and his own did not receive him. Let us be mindful as we move forward this week towards Good Friday, the specific remembrance of the death of Christ by God's mercy on behalf of sinners, that you and I were once lost, trapped, stuck, and basking in our unbelief, until God, in his kindness, allowed the light of Christ to penetrate our darkened hearts. Oh, brothers and sisters, rejoice. Rejoice in this coming King. Hear Zechariah say, look at Christ. He's your hope. Grace and peace to you as we continue through this week in the worship of our conquering and saving King, Jesus. Grace and peace to you.